yourself and your coworkers rely on for their income and hence survival. Therefore, you will do what you need to protect yourself and your life-sustaining company. It is providing for your standard of living. In other words, there is a built-in short-sightedness. And this survival element, which is only operational in our current profit-oriented system, is what is stopping needed change from coming to pass. I could probably ramble off many examples of new advents that have been pushed to the side because they're either too efficient or too sustainable for the market system to absorb, or simply money can't be made continually off of them. It can't perpetuate the system, or it puts an industry out of work. It puts people out of work. There is a human element to this. So there's a natural need, a natural attribute, where people say, well, okay, this is probably better for society, but I need to make money now. I can't think about the transition, so let's just push this aside for now. That's what's happening over and over and over and over again. It's not that they're bad people or anything like that. This is what the system has created. Simultaneously, let's remember that the market system requires constant problems. In order for the public interest in consumption to be maintained, problems and cultural influence is required. The more problems there are, the better the economy, generally speaking. In this system, it is inherently good for cars to break down. It is good for people to get cancer. It is good for computers to become quickly obsolete. Why? More money. To put it into a sentence, change, abundance, sustainability, and efficiency are the enemies of the profit structure. Progressive advancements in science and technology, which can resolve problems of inefficiency and scarcity once and for all, are in effect making the prior establishment's servicing of those problems obsolete. Therefore, in a monetary system, corporations are not just in competition with other corporations. They are actually in competition with progress itself. Thank you. And again, this is why it's so difficult to have any form of change in a monetary system. You simply cannot have a social convention where money is made off of inefficiency and scarcity and misery and expect a quick incorporation of new advents that can relieve these problems. Okay, with that understood, let's get back to the energy problem. The final issue I'd like to point out is this. Apart from the fact that there's a great deal of money to be made by the select few as the majority suffers, apart from the fact that the established energy institutions have little motivation to forego their profitability to alter society's energy mediums, is the very harsh reality that due to the outstanding debts globally right now, I think as we all know, the Earth is essentially bankrupt, as hilarious as that is, there is likely not going to be enough money to change anything. And I want everyone to think about this very critically. As exciting as the potentials are for renewable energy in the fields of solar, geothermal, tidal wave, and the like, potentials that have been documented thoroughly that will far exceed the global energy consumption by thousands of percent. We still have the serious problem in our current structure of financing the infrastructure to make this transition. How do we transition into a new infrastructure where every single government on this planet, every country owes money to someone else, where they're seen as systemic breakdown of bankruptcy starting to occur in Europe, and the United States is just a matter of time. Given the current state of affairs and the urgency of renovation, especially with peak oil, how can we possibly afford to make a transition to these renewable energies before the scarcity of oil begins to shut down due to excessive oil prices because of supply and demand? One study by a leading expert in Sweden predicts by 2030, the world will be using 10 barrels of oil for every new barrel discovered or extracted. That's really not that far away. So, how can we expect the United States, with over $12 trillion worth of debt, barely able to cover its interest payments to other governments, with state bankruptcies occurring, near depression-level unemployment, cutting social programs, we're already selling off infrastructure to foreign countries. How can we expect to afford to move into a new infrastructure? I'm using energy as just a singular example. There's many other problems that we have to deal with. In 2008, the executive director of the International Energy Agency stated that it would take $22 trillion in investment to update the global energy supply infrastructure by 2030. $22 trillion. Where is that money going to come from? Do you really think that we're going to get away with just randomly printing more and more money in the central banks and expect no inflationary repercussions or debt collapse repercussions. Remember, all money comes into existence from loans. There has to be an initiator. Every single dollar in all of your wallets is owed to somebody by somebody. And this, again, leads us into the heart of the disease. The economic, monetary-based system, or the game, as I like to call it, because that's all it is. That's all it ever was, a game. And we can change the game anytime we want. We just need to convince those who are winning the game to put down their pieces for a moment and ask themselves if the game they are playing is really going to reward them in the long run. In a report coming out of the AFP, there is growing evidence that the current rate of our resource exploitation indeed has a time frame. The report states, quote, "As it is, humanity each year uses resources equivalent to nearly 1.5 Earths to meet its needs," said the Global Footprint Network, an international think tank. We are demanding nature's services, using resources and creating CO2 emissions at a rate 44% faster than what nature can regenerate and reabsorb. This means that it takes the Earth just under 18 months to produce the ecological services humanity needs in 1 year. And if humankind continues to use natural resources and produce waste at its current rates, we will require the resources of 2 planets to meet our needs by the early 2030s. A gluttonous level of ecological spending, in their terminology, that may cause major ecosystem collapse, the report said. Now, by the way, I want to point out that people hear that and they have a Malthusian notion. They think that our consumption patterns are somehow inherent and they're not going to change. I read a statistic recently, and for my new film, I'm going to do a huge section on waste attributes of certain industries. And what I've come to find is that of all the production that's done, on average, 75% is waste. 75% is waste. Of all the materials that are created and put into circulation and taken out, 90% of those end up in landfills, I believe, within 6 months. This isn't about some natural human thing that we're doing. This is about the social system's obsession with constantly consuming for the sake of economic growth. In an analysis done by the IRRC, by 2025, it's predicted that 2/3 of the world will experience water scarcity. 2/3 of the world by 2025. Many seemingly wealthy countries are already turning to desalination processes. In turn, over 1 billion people are starving on this planet. Do you, with everything that we have discussed, think that any of these things are going to get better, given our current financial crisis? And again, in case you haven't figured it out, the problems of water scarcity and food scarcity is indeed 100% economic. There are many types of desalination processes which could take salt water and convert it into clean water in all of these poor countries. But guess what? No one has any money to implement these types of solutions in poor countries. The same goes for food. We've gotten to a point with scientific invention that we don't even need arable land anymore, which, by the way, is eroding at a rate about 1 inch a year due to the abusive agricultural methods that are being utilized. Please note, it takes about 500 years for fresh topsoil to emerge. Hydroponics and aeroponics alone, if applied correctly, could provide for all the world's people without the wasted water resources in part and the excessive need for nitrogen-based fertilizers. In fact, you could build these facilities on the land that is depleted in stories. You could have skyscrapers, if you will, of organic food production on an industrial level. But once again, who has the money to do that? And on an extremely enraging and sad note, the more we experience social breakdown, the more human exploitation, crime, and abuse will occur. While here in America we think that slavery was abolished many decades ago, the fact is there are now more slaves in the world than any time in human history given the definition of slavery. However, this time it doesn't come from the form of owning people, it is simply the globalization attribute of exploitation for cheap labor. I'm going to stop here as far as talking about the negative attributes inherent in our system, along with the ongoing social collapse, which, by the way, I personally can't see an end to for a very long time. if at all, frankly, until we move into something more sustainable. The personal and private debts, for example, are so high right now that it's going to take a number of bubbles to burst before any type of so-called stability is going to occur. Anyway, before I go on to the final section of this talk, which is essentially an introduction to the Venus Project and a resource-based economy, let me summarize by saying that the monetary paradigm, economic structure as we know it, is again the basic systemic source of the majority of the world's problems we have around us. In this system, if this cancer is allowed to grow unabated, spreading its malignant propensities across the globe, utterly decoupling from the natural world and the carrying capacity of the earth, destroying the finite resources we all share, we are on pace with nothing less than something that no one can even consider of a collapse. And I'm not talking about waking up one day and there's nothing anywhere. It's not like that. It's where slowly it arose to a point where the values and the culture and the awareness becomes so distraught and so confused that the levels of quality of life become justified, where you start to accept less and less. It's going to slow everything down to a crawl. And invariably, there will be some dramatic accents, if you will, of severe problems, especially when it comes to the energy crisis that is looming. Something radical has to be done. We are approaching a terminal stage. Part 3, treatment. There are two angles to consider when attempting to resolve these problems. The first is the mentality of the culture, as we've discussed before, the cultural programs, and the second is the actual structure of social operation. As noted earlier in our discussion, these two attributes are deeply interlinked. However, regarding the first issue of cultural conditioning, we need to employ what I call, as a movement, we need to employ what I call social therapy. Social therapy refers to adjusting a society's values, changing the value programs. We must have sustainable values in order to have sustainable practices. I would suggest that the first program that needs to be uninstalled from our mental hardware is the social distortion that generates conspicuous consumption pushed forward by the corporately aligned advertising agencies. The value orientation of having more and more stuff, regardless of their utility or function, is an unsustainable ideology inherently on a finite planet. Consumerism and materialism, again, are sicknesses, culturally created to perpetuate the cyclical consumption needed to fuel the market and labor system. This is precisely what the Zeitgeist movement is trying to do. We can't do anything until people understand the need for this direction, which is why we're here right now, which is why this is being webcast, which is why those involved in the movement are diligently working, not to create infrastructure yet, but to try to get these values out there. We will address the movement directives in the second half of the program. Beyond that, as far as the actual structure of society, I'm afraid we require nothing less than a complete and total revision. And this is where the Venus Project again comes in. I'm going to run down 5 of what I consider to be the central attributes required to move into a resource-based economy. 1, we must move from a growth economy to a steady-state economy. The cancerous consequences of the infinite growth paradigm must be stopped before it's too late. In the final analysis, given our technological ingenuity at this stage, we propose the absolute elimination of the monetary system itself. There's no reform possible to stop what the system is doing. The scarcity and waste we see around us is created by us, not some intrinsic process of nature or some Malthusian inherent tendency. The need of money is no longer relevant and is extremely detrimental, in fact. Second, we must move from a primitive, competitive, invention-oriented system, work system, to a collaborative system. Not only are all goods produced in our current society inherently inferior, by the way, due to the need to maintain a competitive cost basis in the marketplace, but the competitive system also generates massive amounts of corruption. Yes, I agree. The incentive to compete does produce some improved goods and services to a certain degree, but that positive is utterly overshadowed by the planned obsolescence, the inherent planned obsolescence, and the general environmental indifference generated by the necessity to stay ahead of someone else. As an aside, imagine for a moment if the top engineers of the major car companies, rather than competing, got together and decided to collaborate on making the best car possible at a given point in time.
Imagine if we established an incentive system that pulls people together to create the best rather than compete and produce inherent inferiority.
Think about that.